Hi everybody and welcome to now. We've been doing this for the last 3 hours now, so welcome to our third session of the Safety Week. If you haven't been any of the other sessions, my name's John Franklin and I'm Head of Safety Promotion at EASA, and I'm joined here in the studio for this session. Do you want to introduce yourself, Christian?
Good afternoon everybody, I'm Christian Panait. I'm one of the medical experts in EASA, supporting John for this session today.
Thanks for joining us, and I'll get the other panelists to introduce themselves in a few minutes, but I'm just going to quickly kind of set the scene a little bit and talk about some of the logistics for the session and all of these kinds of things. So just for the kind of logistics side of things, so we have different ways to interact. We really love you to give us any questions and comment on anything that you see in the presentation or that you hear in the discussion. So in order to ask any questions, hopefully in the bottom right hand corner you have an app called Slido, where you can go in and both ask questions in the first place, so you can just type them in, or you can also upvote other people's questions so that you can see those, and hopefully what we start to do is get kind of popular questions and we can ask those to the panel as we go through the session. If you have any technical problems, so the first thing perhaps to say, and we have this sometimes with WebEx, is that if you connect through a browser other than Chrome, sometimes there are sound problems. So if you have a problem that you can't hear us with the sound, then maybe either try going back into the browser again, or if you have Chrome, use Chrome. But as I say, if you get any technical questions or challenges, feel free to drop me a message also in the chat, and we'll monitor the two. And if you can't find the Slido and you want to put a question in the chat, put a question in the chat. Because of the way the system works, we automatically turn off all of the cameras and mute all of the microphones for the participants, so only the panelists have the cameras and microphones on. It just saves, we've had a few in the past where somebody goes to make a cup of tea and leave the microphone open, so it kind of saves all of that kind of logistical nightmare in the sessions. So hopefully that's kind of the initial introduction part of this. And in terms of this session specifically, so many of us involved in the panel here have been part of a group specifically looking at the challenge of disruptive and unruly passengers, and we'll particularly talk a lot about that today. Obviously, Christian and I, throughout the pandemic, well, Christian's been leading a lot of the work on the health safety protocol, and certainly, that's really, it's probably an understatement to say that's kept you busy during the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And then we also have some of the panel who joined me. So 2 weeks ago, we had the IATA Cabin Safety Conference in Lisbon. So we actually did a version of this panel live on stage there as well. So it's great to kind of bring people from these different discussions together to talk about this challenge. And particularly, as you say, focusing specifically towards disruptive passengers. But then there are other things associated with that I'm sure might come up in the discussions. So Christian's already introduced himself, so I'll go round as it goes in the order and ask my panelists to introduce themselves. So Nikki, do you want to go first and introduce yourself?
Okay, I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah,
it's Nikki Jones, and I basically am responsible for the liaison between ETF, the European Transport Workers Federation, and EASA on many rulemaking tasks, issues, safety promotion, and I'm also one of the stakeholders and sit on the Safety Advisory Board and the FS Tech. So very much involved with EASA's work, and especially in this area, previously cabin crew. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks Nikki. And Eva, maybe you could introduce yourself next.
Yes, okay, Slara from Riga Airport. So mostly I'm working with the training questions, and as all my colleagues from the EASA side, I'm involved in some safety groups as well. So that is the reason why I'm today here.
And huge thanks particularly to Eva, who's been representing ACI in the airport community in our disruptive passenger work. So yeah, it's great to have you on. Diana, maybe you could introduce yourself next.
Hi, yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diana Stevens. I'm representing EasyJet here today, and I'm the Customer Experience Training Manager. So I look after everything to do with the customer experience, whether that is disruptive behaviour, whether that's, what we deliver on board for our flight crew, our cabin crew and our ground crew. It's great to be here today.
Fantastic, thanks. And actually, it's been really interesting as we've done this work on disruptive passengers recently, is when we've done it in the past, it's been very much safety people talking, and it's been really interesting to expand and get, particularly your point of view, Diana, as coming at it from a different perspective. And that was one of the biggest things that certainly I took away from the discussions we had at the IATA Cabin Safety Conference, is kind of bridging that gap between the customer experience, operations, safety and security, and then kind of the business side, and linking that all together, I think, is really important. So for our next panelist, Katerina, maybe you could introduce yourself next.
John. Hi, everybody. My name is Katerina. If you pick up on accents very well, I'm from South Africa. Obviously, everybody working for Emirates is basically an expat. I've been with Emirates for the last 19 years, also started my journey as cabin crew, and currently responsible for security training of our pilots and our cabin crew. And that includes, under the way Emirates has divided it up, unruly behavior and the usual security topics along with that. Thank you very much for the invite, John.
Fantastic, thanks. Good you could join us again. And finally, Megan from Ryanair.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan Doyle. I'm the in-flight safety and security manager for Ryanair, dealing with all the disruptive passenger reports that our crew send in, and then obviously following up with training. Do we need to add anything else in? And like the rest of them here, started as cabin crew and still currently operate.
Fantastic, thanks. And actually, one thing just to say is we'll share the presentation through both email to everybody who registered and also on the community site afterwards. And I'll also make sure I fix your job title, because somehow when I made this slide, Christian ended up as Manager Safety Office. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I just spotted that. So apologies for that typo.
Management position.
Oh, there we go.
You think that mind. Yes, exactly.
You've done such a good job with the pandemic. Yeah, exactly. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is just give you a bit of an introduction as to what we've been doing in this piece of work. And then, as I say, it will hopefully get into some of the discussions that we've been having. So particularly in terms of the challenge we face as an industry is that, between the different delays, we kind of, and one of the things we've talked about a lot is the idea that, we kind of started off thinking we were running probably a 200 or 400 meter sprint, and all hoping we'd be back to work, summer 2020, and wouldn't this all be great? And then we've ended up, with effectively running a marathon with so many different situations. And there are some people who've run a marathon 10 times over as 100 meter sprints and are completely shattered and tired. People who've come back, perhaps later in the pandemic, looking at all these tired people thinking, well, at least you've had a job, and we've got all these different dynamics at play, and we've been talking about that a lot. And then obviously when it comes to the industry, to the passengers themselves, the different challenges we talk about a lot, we talked about in some of the other panels in terms of safety issues, particularly around staffing challenges and all of the kind of infrastructure and logistics challenges. We add to that within the passenger side with the we've been mass on, mass off. We've had lots of different forms and all the different things with the travel policies around different countries. When you start to look at that at a global level, that in itself has led to an increase, certainly we've seen in Europe statistically, with disruptive passengers. But then you add to that some of the more traditional challenges in terms of alcohol. I think in this, something we've talked about quite a lot with industry, and maybe that's a good place to start. And I'm going to stop sharing now. And maybe Diana, I come to you first, and we look at the airlines perspective, and then the airports, and then I'll come to you, Nikki. Diana, what have you seen in terms of the challenges of disruptive passengers, how it's evolved for you as an airline?
So I think, you're spot on, the landscape of traveling through an airport is very, very different to what it was pre-pandemic. And I think, you know, some of the challenges that we've had is that in the past, it's sort of like been very much a case of, oh, it's usually on the Ibiza flight, it's usually on an Alicante flight, and you can sort of manage it better. Whereas now we're seeing disruptive behaviour across the network, and we can't necessarily predict that. So again, we then had to try and, you know, the way in which we look at it is making sure that we, you know, we prepare our ground crew, we prepare our flight crew and our cabin crew in dealing with some of those challenging behaviours through training, through communications, those sorts of things. I'm not sure if it's anyone else, but I can't actually hear you, John.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. We were joking about this in the first session, is that we've only been doing Zoom calls for 2 years. And there's always somebody who forgets to unmute. And ironically, in the first session, it was the guy from Iceland there. So this time it was me. Katerina, maybe if I come to you next. Yeah, we were talking in Lisbon about, you know, similarly the challenges you've seen and the way the situation has evolved for you at Emirates. And so can you describe that a little bit from your side?
Thanks, John. Yeah, very similar to what Anna described, is in terms of we had traditional flights that were a little bit of a bigger problem than the rest, and now it's a standard across the board. You'll have somebody pop up, and what we find, because we are still mandated to wear masks on all flights, that the mask will be the instigator of the trouble, and then after that it will escalate, because people are either very happy to travel with the mask or they're very unhappy to travel with the mask. So definitely the masks have been a major contributor to the traditional behaviors that we would have still seen, and we've very much tried to overcome that by providing customers with the information that they need, because we understand, and having traveled to Lisbon last week, the week before, standing in a queue for 75 minutes to get to somewhere that would have taken me 10 or 15 minutes in the past, you also feel for them. So giving them the information that they need so that they actually realize it'll take longer, get to where you need to go, and all the requirements that go with it. And then very much similar, training our crew members, putting messages on the in-flight entertainment system that reminds them to wear their masks in flight, etc., to just try and give a little bit of a comfort zone for those customers who still very much are compliant, because that's part of the problem. Most of your passengers are compliant, and not to forget about them and looking after them as well.
And it's a really interesting point, and something I was going to come back to you, Christian, on something I think particularly from our side with the health safety protocol is obviously masks just in general in the public have been, you know, somewhat of a challenging situation, but I think, you know, it's something we've all been trying to reinforce, is to support the people who do feel, you know, do want to wear a mask, and that being kind of at a health perspective very important still to support the pandemic.
Yes, and it's not only to support the people that would feel the need to wear a mask, but it's also to still prevent the spread of COVID, because many have taken the vaccine quite a few months back, usually or most notably end of 2021. So we have a range of the effectiveness of that vaccine. So now we see again increasing of cases. But so we need to put in place something, a bit stronger recommendation, but not going back to the mandate. So still allowing the passengers to decide for themselves in terms of risk. Of course, that is where we don't have still a mandate in place, like the colleague from Emirates mentioned that they have, and also a couple of other countries or a few other countries in Europe that still have the mandate. But going to the facts that we have more unruly passengers across the board, from the medical perspective, we see after the pandemic, not related to aviation itself, but related to more the mental health of everybody, due to the isolation, due to decreased human interaction. We see in all human beings difficulties in accepting behavior of others. We are not so keen to understand and respect what the others want. So this creates a bit of a feeling that leads easier to unruly behavior, to conflicts among passengers or between passengers and crew, and putting that on top of not exactly knowing whether or not they need to wear a mask, or other topics related to COVID, like whether or not they need a test. We have seen passengers stranded in airports, in international airports in Europe, trying to make their way to other continents, but where a test is required within the last 12 hours or things like this, which is making it not really practicable for them to travel. Adding one element on top of each other creates an environment where everybody's on the edge, and you just need to drop one drop of water there to fill up the glass and starting going out. So this is an overall feeling, is just to reassure you that it's not something that we meet only in aviation. It's an overall feeling that we see in human behavior right now.
And it's interesting that, you know, one of the things that, you know, certainly even I found at a personal level, being involved at the heart of promoting the health safety protocol and all these other things, you know, when I've travelled, still sitting there thinking, have I got the right form? And if I, you know, and if I don't know, probably nobody else in the, you know, hardly any other people in Europe are going to know. But I think it was really interesting what you were saying, Christian, and, you know, Diana and Katerina, particularly giving the passengers as much clear information as possible about what's expected of them, and particularly in the discussions we've had in our group over the last sort of 2 months or so putting the campaign together. It's that, you know, being really clear about what's expected of them. And then there's the added challenge of, you know, how do you reach all of the passengers who would probably never ever look at any information you give them, and then they suddenly get to the aircraft and they're surprised. And, you know, I know, Megan, we've talked about it, you know, some of the, you know, having flown from Cologne with Ryanair and seeing your poor cabin crew while I'm sat on row 1 handing out masks to people who, you know, coming to Germany didn't know that masks were a challenge. Yeah, I think that's something, you know, you see these challenges also every day. Can you talk about what you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. With the change and, you know, how often it was changing, and, you know, the guidelines were changing, and did you need a test, did you need the mask? And now particularly across Europe, where, you know, some countries still have their masks, some countries don't have their masks, it is difficult for passengers to know exactly what they need to wear and what they need to bring with them. Thankfully, obviously PLFs are gone, which was a big issue for us at the gates and stuff, making sure that passengers had those documents and, you know, not preventing them from traveling if they didn't have them. And then obviously with the crew on board, then the masks were an issue with people not wanting to wear them, people not being aware that they had to wear them. Obviously it's difficult for them to deal with it, particularly now, like they could be operating flights where some flights you don't need them, some flights you do need them. So it is quite difficult for them at the moment.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's something that we've seen obviously as a theme throughout whenever we're talking to small airlines, large airlines. You know, they're continually changing information, and, you know, hopefully we've reached at least a level of stability now. It was interesting. My daughter flew over to visit us here in Germany last weekend, and she immediately WhatsApped us, ironically, from the airport and said, I didn't need a test, did I? You know, when it was, thankfully, you know, the situation is a bit easier in many cases. But I remember, you know, similarly, when people were heading to the IATA conference in Lisbon, wherever you were coming from in the world, there were different requirements. And I remember the organisers from the IATA office in Montreal with the challenge over Canadian, the acceptability or otherwise of Canadian vaccines, for example. And again, the more information that we can provide as clearly as possible was, again, one of the key takeaways I think that keeps coming, and something I'll talk about the campaign in a little while. But maybe, Eva, if I can come to you next. From an airport perspective, you know, what kind of challenges have you faced, particularly, I guess, more recently, but throughout the pandemic in terms of disruptive passengers?
Actually, the same problems as for the airlines. One of the problems, of course, is the alcohol consumption. The second one is mask wearing, aggressivity from the passengers' side, and that's mean that we have to work very hardly with the training questions as well. And of course, the information providing for the passengers, as you already said, clear, understandable, and we have to follow all the like changes because it's happening quite often. So, and that's very challenging actually.
And I think, yeah, that's one of the things that particularly, I guess, Katerina, you face the same, well, all of you, I guess, who are involved in training staff in all these, you know, different situations, you know, have really had that challenge to deal with. And maybe, in fact, as we start talking about the staff element of it, you know, one thing particularly, maybe Nikki, if I come to you next, is the challenge we have as organisations to make our staff feel supported and trained and ready. And then also, when, you know, something we've talked about a lot, I know, in the group, is when there is a disruptive passenger situation and a member of staff has to make a decision about, you know, whether to offload somebody or whatever they do, is, you know, how can we support our staff with the situations they find themselves in?
Yes, John, it's been a very difficult and challenging time for the operators. Is my internet okay? Just quickly.
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. That's
yeah,
great.
it's been a very difficult and challenging time, obviously, for the operators. And I think the whole return to normal operation came a lot faster than expected, which then brought its own challenges. And one of the difficult things is the balance around the recruitment of personnel, the compliance of regulations, and the training that's necessary to have the correct personnel working in the relevant areas for the compliance. And I think what we've seen from a staff point of view is that disruption of passengers has increased dramatically. And it's a lot to do with as well, because of this difficult balance and shortage, is that you've got so many delays, cancellations, restrictions on flight, mask wearing. Passengers are confused, staff are often confused, and it's that whole, you know, sort of ball game of everything sort of cumulating in one place. And staff, because of shortage of staff as well, big shortage, you've then got the problems of the pressure, the increase in work pressures, the mental health, which Christian mentioned earlier, mental health and well-being, returning after not working, then in environments that are very challenging. We've also got that just, you know, this sort of massive pressure that these people are under on the front line. And I think we're seeing it, the cabin crew are struggling and suffering in the same way, but I think we see more from a ground handling point of view, is on the front line with the ground handling, is the shortage of staff, the training element is possibly not as good as it could be for disruptive passenger behaviour. And so those are some of the challenges that we are sort of seeing from a personnel point of view.
And it's particularly interesting that, in fact, we were talking about it in a slightly different context in the SMS and resilience session we had this morning, was particularly in terms of, you know, how we coordinate between organisations, particularly how we, well, I guess two sides. First, how within our organisations, how we communicate to our frontline staff in terms of support, in terms of expectation and training and those kinds of things. But then one of the other challenges is then how do we coordinate between organisations? And perhaps we'll come to the second part in a minute. But maybe if I come back to you, Diana. And, you know, I know you've been doing a lot in terms of training your staff in terms of, you know, all these different measures and all the challenges they face. Maybe you can talk a bit about the things you've done in your organisation or in the airline to help educate and train staff in the different challenges.
Definitely. So I think what we've tried to do is provide some tools, some skills for our crew, and as well as we make it available to all of our ground crew partners as well, is that they've got these, you know, competencies, if you like, that they can draw upon in any sort of situation. So, you know, whether it is a true disruptive, you know, situation with regards to alcohol, whether it's a mental health issue, whether it's another particular issue that a customer is facing, we provide them with these de-escalation techniques and tools and skills that they could utilize in whatever situation. Because I think, you know, to my point earlier, is that before we could almost predict where the problem was going to be, whereas now we don't know, and we don't know the severity of it. Whereas what we can do is provide our people, and to some of our third parties as well, is this toolkit for them to draw upon as and when they need to do it. And I think that that process has worked really well, because it allows our crew to be a little bit more flexible, rather than saying, you know, in this situation you need to do X, Y, and Z. In this situation you've got a bank of things that you could use. Think about what you might want to use on that particular day. And I think, just to follow up on the second part, is the support. And, you know, we've been very, very active and very vocal with all of our people to say, if you need to make a decision to, say, offload a customer, that is absolutely fine, because you have got, you know, very good reason as to why you've done that. You've worked together as a crew, you've communicated with your pilot and potentially the ground crew as well. So you've made that decision, and we will support that decision, and then we will make the assessment of the customer whether they fly or not with us again.
Yeah, and I think that's, you raise so many important points there, and I think it's that, you know, A, that clarity, and then B, the communication and the coordination. And maybe, Katrina, I come to you again, and, you know, maybe you can talk about some of the situation, some of the things you've been doing also in Emirates, and, you know, preparing your staff and handling, I guess, even, you know, a global problem must make that even more, global operation like yours must make that even more interesting.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it makes a few unique challenges. But firstly, I'd like to give a shout out to one of the attendees. I invited him last minute, Gavin Elliott Wilson. He's our manager, ground operations standards and procedures. So approximately a year into COVID, we realized that if we work together, cabin crew and ground, we can actually achieve more. So he has done a huge amount of work in being the eyes and ears of the ground, because the cabin crew will tell us where it goes wrong on the ground, and then he's able to identify and help those stations, because usually it is a thing of helping those stations. So Gavin, you guys have made a huge difference. And it was very much about getting together through the COVID safety action group that we created, and listening to people in other parts of the business and saying, what are you guys doing? What can we better communicate with our staff? And pretty similar to what other people have said was, as people come back into the business, we also needed to make sure that they are okay, because you don't know the circumstances that they are coming back from. And if they are supported by their individual line managers, they are capable of doing a much better job. And we've seen that with our cabin crew and our pilots as well, because lots of our people were made redundant, and then we're very happy to come back. But then there was the reality of they haven't been flying for 2 years, so we needed to retrain them. And all of a sudden there is a COVID problem in terms of mask non-compliance, and then the usual in terms of unruly behavior, alcohol and smoking. We've had a lot more smoking in the cabin as well than we used to previously. So that was an interesting trend that has come back. It's almost like they are a little bit less compliant with smoking in the cabin than they used to be before.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because smoking wasn't something we'd seen necessarily in our statistics. But yeah, again, you talked about that when we were in Lisbon, and I know some other people had spoken about the same challenge. And I remember I was speaking to somebody at Brussels airport, and I found it particularly interesting that some of the long haul flights at Brussels, they have a smoking area they created where a lot of the long haul flights from Brussels go. And then they made a point of making a reminder that we're going to start boarding in 15 minutes, basically go and have a last cigarette, as many of you in that small space. But it was interesting, that kind of dynamic risk management is knowing, you know, Brussels Airlines particularly have this, they have 5 gates at the end of the international pier where they do all of their kind of main long haul non-Schengen flights. It's interesting to see, you know, these almost, I wouldn't say pop-up solutions, but I think, you know, it is in a sense somewhat of a kind of pop-up solution, the way they've solved that. And maybe, Megan, if I come to you in terms of, you know, again, you've got lots of stakeholders to collaborate with, and, you know, how do you solve those kind of dynamic challenges of, you know, all of the different service providers and the cabin crew and all those different pieces of the organization?
Yeah, so we'd have managers in each of our stations that should a crew report issues and, you know, possibly not getting the backup from ground staff during the boarding process and the sort of passengers have made it to the aircraft, they can then follow up with that station and kind of get the word out that, you know, if they see anything unruly at the gate, that yes, they can offload passengers. They don't have to just push it onto the crew. And the same for the crew, like if they have made a decision to allow somebody to travel, that, you know, when you do review a report and you think, oh, it's possibly that you could have gotten rid of them, is that we do give them a call and let them know that, yes, if you deem somebody who is going to cause you trouble during the flight, you can offload them. And yes, we will support you because you're going to provide us with a report. You're going to give us the information as to why you decided to offload them. And absolutely, that's a big thing for us, is to let the crew know that, yes, we will support you if you make a decision to offload somebody. So that's really important for me and my team anyway in the safety office, is to get that message out. And communication being a big thing is to talk to each other during the boarding. You know, the guys down the back might see something that the guys at the front don't see, and just make sure that there's always clear communication between the crew, not just cabin to cabin, but cabin to flight deck, and then also with the ground staff and the dispatchers that are there too.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a word cloud in the first session about what's the biggest success story or the biggest takeaway everybody's had from the last 2 years in terms of safety, and communication was like by far the biggest topic or the biggest word that came out of that. And it's interesting, as you say, we keep coming back to clarity of communication in the organization, and something we talked about particularly in terms of with contracted services when we were talking about SMS, where you've got particularly contracted gate staff or people at airports and things, is kind of the clear expectation, not just in your own organization, but to those you contract the services to as well. I think it's an interesting one. And particularly, Eva, I know from your side in terms of when we were talking about training, I think for the airlines, that disruptive, the disruptive passenger training, and particularly in terms of de-escalation techniques and things, is something that's fairly normal. It's in the rules, and that it's something that happens. But I think from the airport and the ground handling side, that was the thing that you've done a lot of work to do. And I know, how did you find, I guess, developing something that perhaps you hadn't necessarily done so much of in the past before?
So as I have experience from the airline side as well, so that was the first point we start actually in the Riga airport, to share the information and to cooperate with the airlines and to explain for ground staff how important is their role and role, because if they are not providing information about the smokers, about alcohol problems or some mental problems, of course these passengers are going to the aircraft. And then for long haul flights, I'm so sorry for these cabin crews who have to solve this problem, because a lot of problems we can actually solve already on the ground. What can I see through statistics? We are working on only with the questions where we already involve the police. So that's mean with the hard questions, not with the daily problems. And that is a reason why we are talking about these questions in the safety management groups as well in the airport. We are trying once per month. And the second one, we have a special service benchmark group where we involving all the stakeholders and airlines, as well as Ryanair have a base in Riga. So I hope that we're gonna see soon the Ryanair representatives as well in this safety group. So, and for the question about the training, very important, as already mentioned, the colleagues from the airline side, to give the tools how to solve this situation, not to escalate like very heavy conflict. And the second one, like provide some short checklist, like give very, very clear explanation how to deal with the situation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Eva. And maybe as we talk about the staff, particularly, maybe Nikki, I'll come back to you in terms of kind of strategies that organisations can use to help support their staff, and whether it's at a personal well-being level or then also at a in terms of the process itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, John, I mean, because I was just going to go back off some of the things that people had said there as well, first of all.
That would be great too, yeah.
Yeah, just to sort of say, you know, it's imperative if we can try and resolve some of this through the ground handling journey, through the airport journey, we won't get as much of it once they reach the aircraft. So, you know, it's best that we, like you're saying, basically Eva was saying that this coordination is imperative, because if we can coordinate between the operators, the ground handling service providers and the airports and find a common goal to get through the system, we should hopefully prevent this getting to the aircraft at some point, which again is one of the things that we're trying to do. But then back to your question, John, about, you know, we need to listen to the staff. The staff are under a lot of pressure. And I think sometimes what I'm starting to witness myself, and I'm from that staff community, is the staff are becoming aggressive at times, because the pressures on them now, because of shortage of staff, they're working very long hours. Some places have not got the same sort of support that the people on this panel can give, which is creating fatigue, pressure on individuals. You know, they therefore also themselves are struggling to then pop, if you know what I mean. So they are becoming not aggressive staff, but are being aggressive in their way in response to an aggressive passenger, and sometimes that doesn't help with the situation. So again, we need that support from the employer to ensure that the well-being of the individuals, there's the support there so that they can breathe, they can give that customer service and de-escalate situations. But because they're getting to that point where it's just becoming too much pressure for them, it's creating maybe a possible conflict between the passenger and the staff member, and that is something we've really got to think about going forward, because of the continual pressure and long hours that are expected of them.
And it's in. Oh, go on. Sorry. Yeah.
If I may add here to what Nikki mentioned, this is quite an important aspect, because in addition to the legal support and the support on the decision that they make, they should be able to access areas of support for their well-being, similar to what we have created for the pilot peer support groups, but this could be extended to other categories. Because as Nikki mentioned, from the well-being perspective, staff members, crew members have also went through 2 years of relatively low amount of work, low interaction with passengers, and all of a sudden they see an increase in number of passengers, the increase in unruly passengers as well, and even managing one unruly passenger event per one flight gives a higher level of fatigue compared to a normal regular flight. So crew members as well as ground staff, they need to have a bit of time to adapt to this new situation and to the resuming of very intense duties. And for that, and also in this part with adaptation, they also need to be able to go and discuss with their peers, go and discuss with their managers about this in order to find ways to actually handle this in their mind and be fine with this. Otherwise, this entire fatigue will decrease their threshold of tolerability, and as Nikki mentioned, can contribute to a potential conflict with some unruly passengers. So in order to manage, of course, the biggest part is training them and supporting their decision, but also taking care of their well-being in order to minimize their potential of getting into a conflict. So they need to still be calm and try to solve the problem rather than getting into a conflict.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, and actually I took this out of the slide deck. We talked about it a bit earlier in one of the previous sessions, but I'm just going to pop this on the screen a second. Is kind of at the heart of the ramp up campaign when we built it. Hopefully you can see this here. So this is the kind of stronger, safer together part of this campaign, and part of the irony actually of the whole having a safety week thing is that the whole point of safety week is that it wasn't just about a week. but that, you know, it's something that continually happens, and we don't say, hey, we're going to have a safety week and then we do something else week, if that makes sense, which is, you know, part of the irony. So we introduce this to word always as well as a long-term behavior. But it's interesting, or one long-term goal rather, but one of the key things as part of when we built this basic structure is we had this, well, we had these 6 blocks that basically make up effectively the key conversations that we have around what it means to operate safely and effectively, but particularly then around the culture element, and, you know, how do we create trust that supports these positive conversations, however it needs to take place in terms of, you know, between organizations and individuals, organizations and you know, between organizations, in this case the passenger journey. And I'll come back to this in a second, interestingly, in terms of, you know, how do we coordinate between airport handling organization, airline, even, you know, we've got an interesting question about how do, within an airline, even one airline, could you coordinate on connecting passengers going from one flight to another, and I'll come back to that in a second. But particularly around the people part is, we did, some of you hopefully have seen, we have a wellbeing resource hub, but what we start to realize is that just talking about well-being in isolation doesn't necessarily help. And it's this wider, what we have in the people box here, which is that in having enough skilled, competent and qualified, competent and skilled people, but then who are operationally ready and fit for duty. And what does that mean in terms of, you know, whether it's supporting well-being? We've seen a lot, you know, organizations start to expand their peer support programs into you know, beyond the regulatory requirement in terms of flight crew, to particularly cabin crew, to maintenance, to ops, to in some cases the whole organization. But it's then, you know, links to the culture here then of, you know, how does that peer support program interact? You know, do we have these common conversations that discuss these different challenges? And, you know, almost again what we were talking about in the first session on resilience is not just necessarily relying on, oh, we get a report, but having continual conversations. So anyway, I'll take that back off the screen again now. And interesting, maybe we come to the first, so I've got the first question here, which starts to link into the solutions and particularly the coordination element that, again, we've talked about quite a lot in our disruptive passenger group, and we also talked about on the panel in Lisbon, is maybe perhaps for the airlines as a first question, within you as an airline, is if you get, maybe Katrina, I come to you first, knowing that, you know, at Emirates you have, you know, a lot of connecting traffic, specifically in Dubai, is do you have ways that if a passenger's coming in on one flight, you know, you can notify then the next flight and make a decision before that kind of connection happens? Do you have that kind of a process?
Actually, very fortunate. Our persons who's the in-flight in charge actually have a tablet, and that tablet has all the passenger data of that flight, and they have the ability to send a notification to the in-flight in charge for the next flight to notify that there was something wrong. And in addition to that, when they arrive, because all our connections would be here through Dubai, when they arrive here, we have the option of not necessarily getting the authorities involved, but also group security, who may actually take the person aside, have a chat with them, assess their fitness to fly onwards, etc. But what we find, the person notes, as we call them, is the #1 essential tool to make sure that there's consistency in reviewing whether this person is #1 fit to fly on their next flight, and #2 whether the behavior that they've displayed previously has been continuous on future flights. And then based on that information, we can actually say, is this a person that we should have a chat to before they ever fly on their next flight? And because we handle unruly behavior under group security, we actually have group security staff who can do that. So yeah, I would say that is very helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like a really clear process that really supports that kind of communication and decision making throughout kind of the passenger's journey or situation as a potential disruptive passenger. And maybe Diana, from your side at EasyJet, obviously your networks kind of cross? I guess it's less of a, you have less people connecting necessarily, but is that something you have the ability to do within the airline?
Yes, so we don't traditionally offer a connecting service like what we've just described just there. But I think what we have tried to do is if somebody is disruptive on any sort of level, we have our usual reporting processes, whether that's through the cabin crew, whether that's through the pilots, or whether that's through our ground crew. That is then assessed by our security team, and they will do that assessment quite quickly. They have got a matrix that they will use, and at the end of that assessment process, which can take just a few moments, we will then make a decision whether this person will fly with us again. If the decision is made that they will not fly with us again, we will actively communicate with that customer, and we'll make sure that that if they do have any future bookings, they may be cancelled, or we will make sure that it is highlighted at the ground level. So if that customer then does turn up, then they will realise that that unfortunately they won't be able to fly with us on that particular flight. And there's varying timescales that we will use depending on the behaviour that the customer has displayed.
And I guess that's one of the, is it in terms of then how that links to future travel, you also then have, and we've talked about this in other contexts with Lisa before in Lisbon, is that most of you as airlines operate no-fly lists that then enable you to kind of make early decisions where that's possible. Absolutely,
yes. So initially we'll make the decision whether that customer should fly if it's a ground handling report. So it's a no, they won't fly at the moment. If they've got a return booking, then we can then just cancel that return, and then it's about what do we do for future bookings, whether they the behaviour they displayed is significant enough to say actually this customer's not welcome on board the flight going forward, and that will be, as I said, differing times depending on the behaviour that they've displayed.
That makes sense. So maybe Eva, I could come to you next from an airport perspective, kind of as obviously you see from the airport the passenger kind of coming through before the flight. How do you find and how do you manage the kind of liaison then within the airport with handling agents, handling the passengers, and doing the boarding process then, and with the airline as well? Is that, I guess you have to work quite hard at those different relationships.
Actually, I already mentioned on that previously, because it helps if we are sharing this information, because as I said, the ground staff role actually is very important, not to lead this passenger who can become destructive to the long flights. And not only for the long flights, actually for the short flights, sometimes problems are much more bigger than for the long flights. And we are not using like a system that we are using the tablets or computers or something like that, but we are using the notifications for the passengers. And the second one, of course, the information we are providing through the radio for the staff, if we know the passenger journey, where he gonna fly the next flight. So, and of course, chat with the passenger, just to see, because sometimes, as already colleagues mentioned, sometimes conflicts come from the staff as well, as from the airline staff, as from the ground handling staff. So, and afterwards we are just making decision. Passenger can continue the journey, or he must stay for a while in Riga. So a lot of tools we can use actually.
I think is something we've talked a lot about in the group. Maybe Megan, I come to you next. Is that is that kind of as a passenger almost moves through the airport, is that interface. And I highlighted the question here where I'm not going to specifically ask anything about numbers of loaded passengers from any particular operator, but in terms of the decision to offload, and do you find, I guess in most cases, the airport and the handling agent will ask the operator flying that passenger for that final decision, and how you handle that and how you provide training to the different staff to help them do that?
Yeah, so for us, we would obviously encourage our ground staff. We have some self-handling airports, we have others that are contractors that look after handling, but we would encourage them to stop that behaviour at the gate so it doesn't go any further. obviously it's much easier to deal with this person before they're on an aircraft. And then we do say to our crew, like, they are the last line of defence. I know that's kind of probably a heavy line to say, but like, if they ultimately have the decision on who travels, and if they don't want them to travel and they have a valid reason for it, absolutely get them off the aircraft. But a lot of the times, like, you know, during COVID, we saw a lot of information about wearing your mask, wash your hands, here's the hand sanitizer, but you tend not to see a lot of information about behaviours and stuff like that in the airport. So for us, like, it would be great to see from the moment you step into the airport, throughout your whole journey through the airport, there is these warnings and there is these, you know, you need to behave in a certain manner. If you drink too much, you're not going to fly. At least then the passengers, they're aware of it. How much they will actually read is another thing, but they would be aware of it coming through the airport, and it might be easier to stop this behaviour before it ever gets to the crew. And again, that's just communication out to the public, as well as, you know, communication out to our teams that, you know, they have this opportunity to not allow people to travel. Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned that. So I know that we've got, in fact, Bjorn, one of the members of our group, who's part of working with you at ETF, Nikki, but I was particularly interested. He sent us, after within our group, we've been continually wrestling with the fine line of, you know, a be ready message and a be ready message, be kind and be nice to the forward-facing staff, for want of a better word, or the customer-facing staff, and then particularly if you drink too much, or, you know, any unruly passenger behaviour will not be tolerated, and that kind of fine line between them all. But actually, it was interesting then that I saw an example from Brussels Airport, where they actually have a really fantastic campaign that's very, like you were saying there, Megan, sort of almost in your face about, you know, our staff are, you know, should not be expected to deal with this challenge. And, you know, Nikki, I know we've talked quite a lot about that, kind of the fine line of the different parts of communication on that sense. You know, how do you feel from a staff perspective that the challenge of those different messages? You know, it's always a difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, just going on your coordination for the offload of passengers. One thing that we would like to see from a staff point of view, because obviously, as we hear now from the operators, they can link within their own operator. But when it comes to then that passengers going on another carrier at that next airport, it's how we can have a link between all the operators about the certain passengers with the bad behaviour. I think that's a massive thing that needs to be done, and could it be achieved? Because there needs to be some sort of link, so we know from different airlines to different airlines who these people are, because it's not always just that one same airline that they're travelling on. But yeah, with regards to the messages to the passengers, from my point of view, it needs to be hard. It needs to be hard for them to listen. And I think it also needs to be that the sanctions that go with it need to also be hard. What we find sometimes from a cabin crew point of view, if we then offload a passenger in a country that is maybe not the country of origin of the operator, there isn't really an awful lot done to the passenger. Yes, they might be taken off by the police, they might have a talking to, but they're back on the next flight. So it's also having a look, what are the sanctions for these people? Because when these sanctions are harder, that message will get out there that we will not tolerate this, and this is what will happen to you. Because the cost of diverting flights, etc., is huge. You know, and I don't know how, you know, those costs, are they then put on the individual? Do they go to court? A lot of the times, no, and it's the airline that bears the cost. And I think if the message was out there that the sanctions are hard, then it's a harder message, and possibly will stop a bit of the behaviour.
And actually, it kind of links on quite nicely what you're saying there, Nikki, and particularly in terms of sanctions when it comes to communication. So there's the question I've just highlighted here from the Slido. Particularly the second part is the support from EASA and NAAs specifically, but it kind of links in a sense also to certainly some airlines and airports might have the ability to do this. But one of the things we've talked about trying to do is quite often, you know, obviously it's very hard to reach passengers, particularly the ones that might be potentially the more likely to be unruly. are very hard to reach. So one of the things we've been talking about, and I'll talk a bit more in a few minutes about the wider campaign that we've been working on, that we're getting ready to launch. But one of the key parts of that is that when a situation, particularly when there's something in the public domain, a news item or whatever about disruptive passengers, is if we can be prepared. It's something I know some NAAs have managed to do very well now, and something we're trying to support more, is that when something comes in the news, if as whether it's a national authority or even in some cases communication departments of airlines or airports, we all have organisations like airlines, airports, authorities have links, particularly to national press in their country, is almost to have a common set of kind of communication points that you can immediately share. So we have this now, and I know some NAAs do, where when something is in the press, you have the opportunity to bounce off that and say, well, look, here's something negative that happened. So I know, for example, some countries, they monitor when they know court cases are coming that lead to some sanctions, is to try and make as much of that as we possibly can, so that in the mainstream media, we get the sanctions message across, in ways that we can't so easily when, just in day-to-day communications almost. So it's one thing particularly we're advocating, and something that potentially, certainly as part of the campaign, is having almost like the key points that when there is something locally or nationally, organizations go, oh, right, we send this to all our media companies so that they can reinforce the messages of the campaign and these things. And it's something that, I know if you're then reacting and it takes 24 hours to put something together to send to the media, well, the story's gone and you miss that opportunity. So I know it's something we talk to our national authorities about a lot. And maybe that's a good time to perhaps move on. We've had a good discussion there for an hour or so, and hopefully we'll come back to some of the other questions. I think we covered most of the points, but we'll come back to them in a minute. But I'll go now back to the PowerPoint, and particularly to talk about the campaign a little bit and some of the things we've been talking about. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Here we go. There we go. So hopefully you could see this. So just to kind of start to summarize some of the challenges we've been talking about, obviously, particularly supporting frontline staff, communication. We've been hearing experiences of different airlines and from the airport side also, how a lot of this happens. But particularly in terms of then some of the solutions we've been talking about within our disruptive passenger group, and particularly then what could we do at a coordinated level within the wider industry, is particularly we talked a lot about how can we help prepare our passengers more for their journey, and particularly this is where this idea of having a coordinated campaign where we can get kind of clear, not necessarily standard messages, but at least try and align messages across as many organizations as possible, so that both us as organizations and then the passengers get the same kind of messages with the same kind of language wherever they're flying, whoever they're flying with. I take even, my family, over the last month or so, we've flown with, even just small things, flown with 3-4 different airlines through various different airports, different members of the family, and probably got very different but slightly similar messages from everybody. And perhaps the more we can kind of align those common messages, and that's particularly what we've been talking about in the campaign, is what we tried to do. Some of you might have seen our Not On My Flight campaign, and that was EASA kind of trying to communicate to passengers ourselves. And I think one thing we realized particularly is that, particularly passengers who are most likely to be unruly are very, very unlikely to even know or care who EASA or the national authority is. So one of the things we've tried to develop within this campaign is something that airlines, particularly, and airports, hopefully can use in their own communications to passengers. I think this is where the discussions, particularly from the airline and airport side we've had in the group, has been really important. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about the campaign, and I'll just really, really quickly talk about what we talk about in safety promotion. Historically, so EASA, our safety promotion strategy was very much, here's a PDF of varying lengths, and we will put that on the internet. And now we're trying to get much more into a more common, kind of more modern approach, where we focus on who are the audience. And that's actually one of the key things, is having information for airlines decision makers. And one of the sort of initial parts of the campaign that we'll email to everybody this afternoon who registered for this event is basically our kind of briefing pack that we put together on what is the campaign and what happens next. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But particularly saying, you know, here we want to communicate to the organizations, the safety managers, the decision makers on what is the campaign to be part of it. Then an element of that is then helping you as organizations coordinate and talk to your staff. How do NAAs interact with that? And then also, how do we communicate to passengers? And then we've got various different pieces of material, whether it's, you know, posts for social media, whether it's longer blog articles that you can share with people, you know, who might make blogs, for example. And then the next bit is then partly the marketing element. And once we've got these different messages that we now have in this campaign package, is how do we get that out to as many people as possible? And actually, one of the things that's, you know, again, examples we talked about is obviously you have your own social media, your own, you know, different channels, and ideally we'd like to harness as much of that as possible. But I know there are a few people we work with who, as individuals in the industry, have social media profiles, you know, already to the general public, and looking to see, you know, how do you as an airline or as an airport have anybody who also is visible, and you could kind of talk to them and use their power. I know certainly we have a couple of people we've been working with trying to figure out how we do that, and then continually looking at how do we, you know, has this worked? How can we help improve continually the coordination? So interestingly, what that looks like for the disruptive passengers is, you know, we see that the number of disruptive passengers has increased over recent years, and you see this here in this short graph here. But particularly then, how do we promote to staff and passengers to start to handle better the risk of unruly passengers? And then in terms of the content, the things we've created, we've got a briefing pack that we'll send out later on and promote also on LinkedIn in order to start getting this going. Social media images and things like that we'll have available for particularly, we know many organizations have their own approach to social media, and hopefully, you know, you can work with, you know, the people that do that in your own organizations to help get these messages to passengers, and using your own approach with these the messages we have, or, you know, we have some images that we've already created that you could just repost or reshare or whatever. There's particularly for airports and ground handling organizations, there's a training package that Eva and the team at Riga Airport created that will be available so that other people can use those. And then the more we can get this message out through all the different channels. So you'll see in a minute, you know, obviously we've got this discussion here and it's great to get questions and feedback. The next step we'll talk about in a minute is actually the launch of the campaign to the wider public, which hopefully we go for on the 18th of July. And then further discussion, we can talk about, you know, whether it's at our SAFE 360 conference in September, about how we're still managing this risk and all the challenges that we face. So just to give you a flavour of what this starts to look like. Now, kind of ironically, this campaign was called the Air Smiles campaign until probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago. But, you know, I think we felt collectively as a group it was quite difficult to talk about smiling a lot, with some of the challenges that we were having. So just to give you, you know, and this kind of gives you a flavour for some of the material. So it's based around the concept of check, know, think, go, and that, you know, whether you're at home ready to go to the airport as a passenger, or just arriving at the airport, and that kind of, you know, when do you arrive, what do you do when you get there, right through then to what you do and your behaviours at the airport, then also on the flight. So there's all sorts of different examples, and we've created material from social media images to you know, things for security screens to, you know, posters to go above, particularly the men's urinals is a good space. I've seen these kinds of campaigns work quite well. So we've got this different material ready, and basically what it looks like, we'd be really interested in your comments and feedback, even in the Q&A or in the Slido here, is that obviously the goal is how do we reduce conflict and manage the risk of unruly passengers, you know, helping frontline staff feel trained, readied, supported and valued, and also then prepare the passengers for their journey and ultimately encourage them to be nice to each other and our staff, appreciate there are consequences when they do things. So what we have is then key messages for airlines and airports to share with their passengers to help them experience the best possible journey. As I say, you can use the material we've provided and developed, or use your own. You know, and I know we've talked in our group with different airlines, and you know there are different approaches people might take to that. You know, ideally encouraging staff and passengers to be part of the campaign using hashtag ready to fly. You know, the more people we can get posting on social media, hopefully positive things, then you know that can be really supportive. And then particularly being committed to collaborating with other stakeholders on a positive passenger journey, so that we have this common approach. And then particularly also acknowledging the important role of frontline staff and help them handle these challenging situations. So there are different deliverables as part of that. So the first thing, I say, we'll send out to everybody today is this kind of campaign description and the briefing pack. And really, you know, what we're interested to try and do is to get as many people supporting an organisation supporting that campaign as possible. So the first step is that today we'll start promoting to industry that briefing package and all of the material, and then on the 18th of July we say, okay, as an industry we want to launch this campaign with as many organisations as possible. So as I say, we then have the key messages for different organisations to use in their own social media, images and short videos that people can use, organisations can use themselves. You know, we know particularly smaller organisations would rather do that and don't have the resources to make their own. You know, the different aspects of the whole check, no, think, go thing, you know, the training package, and then hopefully that's what we start to build up and get more support for then launching this whole thing on the 18th of July. It would be great. So we have our safety promotion email there, address there, and you know, again, feel free to anybody in the audience to connect with me on LinkedIn if we're not connected already. You know, ideally, what we'd like to build up is a, you know, we've got lots of different contacts already in lots of different organizations, but to, you know, have lots of email contact between now and the 18th of July, so that, you know, we promote this as much as we possibly can across the industry. So that's the basic part of the campaign. I'm just going to go back to the chat now and to the Q&A. So indeed, Ibrahim points out, yeah, IATA can be a link between airlines and convey the message, and particularly for those of you that know him, Jonathan Jasper, JJ, who organised the IATA cabin safety conference that many of us were at 2 weeks ago. It will be a key part of that, and he's been involved in our disruptive passenger group from the start. So yeah, that's kind of a key part of that. So I think that's the comments in the chat. I don't know if any of the panel have anything else they'd like to add, particularly those of you who've been involved in the campaign development. Any particular thoughts or comments? I put you on the spot here a little bit.
I don't mind going. So I think one thing is something really, really important to us is working with the EASA on this really important campaign to try and tackle, the issues that we're having industry wide. And I think, to your point earlier, it's not just necessarily our industry, it's almost like worldwide in lots and lots of different industries. So I think, working together on something like this is super, super important. And working with other organisations like IATA, in the UK, we've got Airlines UK, that any opportunity we take to be able to support a comms campaign, support any sort of campaign, but also to get the messages out there. And something else that we've been really, really passionate about is trying to lobby the UK government in changing some of the licensing laws. So, I think everybody pretty much has talked about alcohol, and it's, almost astounding that in this sort of day and age that we have strict licensing laws that we have on the high street. But if you put something in an airport airside, there are none. So it's things like that that, you know, can really help with the messages that we're all trying to get through to people, and to really help the landscape that we now find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I'm going to highlight this. We covered the other question about fatigue and all the other things, but this one particularly about kind of influencing national legislation from an airline perspective and then a national authority perspective, I think is an interesting one, because yeah, we see this with different challenges. In fact, one of the favourite kind of interesting unruly passenger stories I ever heard was an airline, talking to an airline who they fly, I think 90% of flights from a particular airport, from this one airport, and they were finding they had a fairly early morning Ibiza flight that they were having problems with, and they had quite a number of diversions on that flight because of disrupted passengers, and they were effectively paying the airport to keep the bar closed till slightly later, because actually it was easier, it was cheaper for them to pay not to open the bar till 7 o'clock than it was the cost of all the diversions. But it's kind of crazy, as you say, in that situation, that, you know, not many airlines are lucky enough to be in a position where that's even possible, let alone cost effective. But yeah, it's the more we can collectively influence, you know, these kinds of things at national level, I think is particularly important and useful as well. And in fact, it's interesting, there's another comment in the chat there about, you know, informing passengers what kind of behavior is disruptive. And actually, it's one thing I realized we didn't necessarily put so far in the campaign, is actually maybe adding a line that says disruptive behavior includes, you know, I think we would like to think people would know that, but again, I guess being clear is probably useful. So I'll come back to that when we finish this session. So thanks. For any of the other panelists like to add anything on anything in terms of the campaign and those things we've talked to before we start summing up and finishing?
John, I think from this perspective of the last question in the chat there, and also looking at the campaign, you mentioned it before, and I think also Nikki mentioned it before, the target audience in terms of unruly passengers, the ones that are more prone to unruly, either because they are intoxicated with whatever substance, or because they have a certain level of cognitive development that would make them prone to unruly behavior, require certain messaging which will not ask them to read half a page, to identify what actions are assessed as unruly and so on. Has to be simple, clear messages, because they will not read a half a page. It's the same people that will not read or will not search the internet to find out if they need or not to wear a mask, or if they need or not to take a test for COVID, because they simply don't care. They go on the spot, and whatever happens, happens. If they are not allowed to do something, they will start shouting and having some sort of an explosive behavior, which sometimes is part of the unruly side. So we need to focus on this. I think, of course, the part on the training, this is, or from my perspective, not really being involved that much in the safety promotion part. I would see the part of the training of the organization and the staff members being the easy part, because they are used to training already. They know the CRM, they know a lot of processes which are more or less similar in collaborating in terms of promoting safety, which will be, the principles will be more or less the same. But with the unruly ones, that's something, and that's what I see as the main challenge, to make them understand and to reach them directly in a way. What the commentators mentioned here with national part, I think that is something that, and also what you mentioned, to have a sort of a template answers for certain events, I think that is something that is really hitting the nail in the head, because that's the way we can influence national legislation. In my country of origin, I know that all the punishments in endangering flight safety are in the legal code, where you get potential fines or imprisonment, has nothing to do with aviation requirements and so on. So if you promote it there and the legislators at national level understand the severity of this activities, then that might change a bit also the mindset of the people that would go to this type of behavior.
And I think one of the things that I'm going to pick up on that you mentioned there, particularly about the promotion bit, then you say if we're giving, a lot of people who might be unruly passengers aren't going to read 3 pages of text, or go seek out an airport or an airline website on how should I be ready for my flight. That's where particularly it's almost like a bit of a challenge, hopefully, to as many airlines and airports as possible, is how can we particularly, I think, use Instagram, TikTok, dare I say, or even Facebook over the next few weeks to get that message to as many people as possible who might not get our traditional messaging. And I know different airlines social media teams can be exceptionally creative. So the more airlines social media and airport social media teams who have the chance to be creative, and anything anybody might need from us, please let us know. And we really encourage you to kind of be part of this and see how we can work together to collaborate on this kind of messaging.
And one more thing from my side, just to make everybody aware, tomorrow the UN will launch their drug use report, which actually is showing an increase in the use of drug, legal and illegal, and increase in addiction side. So what Katarina was mentioning earlier, that they see a spike in the smokers. This also comes after these 2 years of people getting closer to their addictions, and all of a sudden you put them through abstinence of 3, 5, 6 hours, depending on the duration of the flight and the preparatory part in the airport. They react a bit strange. So we need also in our strategies to consider this and already maybe involve the mental health specialist, addiction specialists that could have certain strategies that are implemented in their work that could be used by the staff members in this other side.
That's an interesting one, and I can imagine that being, as the work continues to evolve, that could be a really interesting activity. So thanks for that. Is there anything else any of our panelists would like to add before then? I'll give you a second just to see if there's anything else, and then I'll come with the last question after that. Nikki, yes.
Yeah, it's just to add to this. Obviously, we've got the campaign around the disruptive passengers, but imperative that there are those support programs. And as Christian mentioned earlier, around similar peer support programs, that the support is there. So when the staff need the help and they ask for help, that they are given that support, and it doesn't become a witch hunt or a bit of fear culture, because we do see sometimes there's a little bit of fear culture in there on reporting or asking for that help. But we do need to have these open, just culture support programs, so people feel that they can come straight to their employer for that help and support, and it will benefit the employer, because with that support they will turn around quicker to get back to do the job that they're supposed to be doing. So it was just to say, please, make sure that support is out there for employees.
Yeah, I think you raised a really interesting point, something actually 2 parts in terms of other campaign activity we have as the year progresses. Is first of all on reporting and just culture, and helping us as an industry how we can improve our understanding of implementing that. And then particularly also peer support programs in general are quite new, and there's beginning to be some really good examples of what does good look like and how do we help people implement those, that again we'll share and will be particularly part of the discussion at Safe 360. Diana, I see you've got your hand up.
And it's just to add to Nikki's point, because it is super, super key that, we listen to our crew and our people to understand, the needs that they have, particularly after a difficult incident. But I think also as managers, we are very quick to say we must help and support other people, because absolutely that's within our remit. But then we sometimes forget about ourselves. So equally, we need to make sure that we have a good network of people around us, a good support program around us as well, to be able to be, the best that we can be to help and support our people.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic message there, Diana, and something we've been talking about even internally within EASA about how do we support the managers, the wider organisation, and how do you bring that through all of the things we do every day. Yeah, so thanks for that one. And maybe if I come, maybe Katerina, if there's any last thoughts from your side.
In terms of programs that we've run in the past, something similar to Ready to Fly, which we called Fit to Fly, it was very effective. So having thought about it carefully, I think there's definitely scope to revisit those programs and reinforce it, especially with the amount of staff changes that we've had. Going back to the basics, saying to our crews, when you are faced with these smoking incidents that you haven't had in many, many years, these are the best practices, etc. And as we mentioned at the conference, looking forward to IATA's guidance on best practices for unruly behavior management and working together, because from panels like these, I have learned so much. And even just understanding that you're not alone in managing these issues and learning from other experts and saying, we can do this, just get together, talk about it and go forward. So thank you very much for the campaign, John. Good initiative.
Thanks very much. And actually, it's interesting what you say there. Something I was talking to somebody in a small regional airline about when we were talking just generally about redoing this safety week like we did last year. They said to me they were sat in their small airline thinking, well, maybe we're the only ones facing this problem. And he said when they saw the discussion at Safety Week that so many other people were doing the same thing, almost it made it much easier for them to talk about within their own organisation, because they realised it was actually something we were all facing as an industry. And I think this is where the collaboration really comes in. Maybe Eva, if I come to you, any last thoughts from your side and from an airport perspective?
Yeah, just to add to the Nikki, Diana, and Catherine, so the closer cooperation between the airports and the airlines, that's very, very important to share this information, to know all the channels, how can we provide this information, make well-being programs maybe together. Example, here in Riga, we can work together with Air Baltic, with the Ryanair's, including the local small ones airports as well. So that could be very nice if we have, as I think Nikki said, one platform for everyone, just to keep updated what we did, what kind of information we can provide, what kind of information we found, and so on, so on. So thank you, John, for this platform.
It's interesting you mentioned, actually, I might take you up on that offer of in terms of the video. So we have our Icelandic cameraman here in EASA, and we're already talking to Sander. I don't know if you know Sander at Air Baltic, yes, who's leading their peer support program. So maybe that's a thing, we could come and do something airport airline handling agent, all with peer support and that kind of thing together in.
Yeah, because actually we started this chapter and like information sharing with Sandra I don't remember, some 4 years ago, because we understood that we have no any guidance materials from the airport's perspective side, because we have a lot of EASA regulations unexplained, because in aviation, for the airlines, that's already long history, starting from the 2004 and something like that. But from the airport's perspective, that starts only 2014. So that means we are quite young in this area where to develop, and that's very good that actually we started this safety benchmark group, which gives the platform where to share information about very important information from the airport side as well. Because this community for the airports not so strong as for the airlines. But as I said already previously, this cooperation between the airports and the airlines is very important as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think that's, it's one of the big themes of the whole, all the different discussions we've been having in terms of promotion is this collaboration and cooperation. And maybe Megan, I come to you for any last thoughts from your side, and then Christian, I'll come and ask you for the last comment before we finish. Megan.
I just think communication will be really important for dealing with disruptive passengers. So, cabin crew with each other, with the ground staff, with the airport, but then also getting the information out to the passengers as well will be really important to kind of highlight that, what behaviours are acceptable and what we deem is not acceptable, and whether or not you can fly. So yeah, communication for us is always really important.
Fantastic, thanks. And Christian, maybe any last thoughts from your side?
I would try to find some words there. Communication, as Megan said, really important. Harmonization of measures. I keep saying since the COVID started that harmonization is the key for most of the problems that we have. And to end it in a funny note, I recently saw in a grocery shop an ad saying, please be nice with our staff members, because good staff members are more difficult to find than clients. So we need to take care of our aviation personnel, because they are really difficult to find, and we can see these days what problems that can cause. Thank you very much, John, for the invitation. Thank you very much to all the panelists for the great discussion.
Yeah, thanks very much, and huge thanks. And ironically, I was looking at the last chat comment in the chat, and particularly, all respect to all of our frontline staff who keep smiling and help us deal with these difficult challenges that we all face. So again, huge thanks to all of you for joining the discussion in terms of the panelists, and particularly also thanks to the audience, particularly for this subject. We kind of, the work continues, and as I say, we'll be emailing you pretty much as soon as I get back upstairs to try and then get as many people as possible from different organisations to sign up and be part of the campaign, so that on the 18th of July, we're all ready to jump together and promote as much as we can. And I'll apologise in advance. People are going to get sick of me on LinkedIn, but never mind. Hopefully it gets us going. So thanks very much. Take care, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.